Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Diane Hennacy Powell's professional journey began conventionally enough, immersed in the rigorous demands and rigid certainties of neuroscience and psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Her initial academic training, steeped deeply in materialism and the strict adherence to empirical methodologies, left little room for the extraordinary claims often associated with the paranormal. Powell herself openly admits she was raised an atheist and educated within a framework that equated psychic phenomena with symptoms of mental illness rather than authentic cognitive experiences. Her medical education emphasized empirical verification, tangible evidence, and measurable outcomes. Consequently, when she first encountered savant syndrome, cases of individuals with profound developmental disabilities who mysteriously exhibited inexplicable abilities, she approached them cautiously, intrigued but skeptical, unwilling to stray far from the established scientific mainstream. Yet Powell's disciplined skepticism soon encountered direct, compelling evidence that fundamentally challenged her worldview. It was her first encounters with autistic savants, particularly children who displayed uncanny intellectual feats far beyond explanation, that initiated this shift. In 1986, Powell first began exploring savant syndrome, drawn by reports of autistic individuals capable of extraordinary cognitive feats such as perfect recall, mathematical genius, or spontaneous fluency in languages they had never formally learned. While the mainstream scientific community either ignored these anomalies or dismissed them as exaggerated anecdotes, Powell recognized immediately that they deserved rigorous empirical study. She found herself repeatedly facing cases that resisted explanation through conventional neuroscience, forcing her to reconsider previously unchallenged assumptions about consciousness, intelligence, and the human brain. It was the cases of Ramsey and Haley that most decisively transformed Powell's worldview, serving as turning points that catalyzed her intellectual evolution. Ramsey was a verbal, autistic boy who, at the astonishingly early age of 2, began spontaneously reading and communicating fluently in multiple languages, including Arabic, Russian, Japanese, and Hindi, without any known exposure or formal education. Powell personally verified Ramsey's linguistic skills at the age of 5, simultaneously observing his inexplicable proficiency in complex mathematics and astronomy far beyond his age level. Similarly, Haley, a nonverbal autistic girl, demonstrated psychic-like abilities when she accurately solved mathematical equations that she physically could not have seen. The therapist's calculator displayed results out of Haley's sight, yet Haley repeatedly provided precise answers instantly and effortlessly, later explicitly indicating she was reading her therapist's mind. These experiences shattered Powell's earlier adherence to purely materialistic neuroscience, compelling her towards openness to phenomena traditionally labeled psychic or paranormal. She began proposing that what these children demonstrated, often dismissed by mainstream psychology as fantasy or fraud, represented genuine instances of telepathy or psi phenomena. Powell did not make this shift lightly or hastily. She describes her transformation as gradual, grounded entirely in her direct observation and empirical testing. Moreover, she found that the existing academic skepticism toward these phenomena was less a result of evidence-based reasoning than of entrenched scientific dogmatism, prejudice, and fear of ridicule within mainstream institutions. Driven by these cases, Powell emerged as an advocate for an expanded scientific methodology, one rigorous yet open enough to explore phenomena typically dismissed as impossible. Her experiences thus represent not merely an academic evolution, but also a profound philosophical shift, one driven by rigorous inquiry and unflinching commitment to evidence, even when it leads to deeply unsettling questions about the very foundations of human consciousness. The cases that Powell encountered were striking, precise, and meticulously documented, evidence not easily dismissed by conventional skepticism. One case stands out vividly, that of Ramsey, a 5-year-old autistic savant whose abilities baffled even seasoned neuroscientists. Ramsey spoke fluently in multiple languages, Arabic, Russian, Japanese, Spanish, English, Hindi, without ever receiving instruction or known exposure to those languages. When Powell personally evaluated him, she observed that at 5 years old, he effortlessly read a college-level astronomy textbook, comprehending complex scientific concepts far beyond the intellectual reach of typical children his age. In controlled settings, Ramsey accurately responded to randomized experimental stimuli designed explicitly to test telepathic perception, achieving results that defied conventional explanations based on chance or sensory perception. Equally compelling, Powell detailed the striking case of Haley, a nonverbal autistic girl whose psychic abilities were unexpectedly discovered during a routine therapy session. Haley communicated through a specialized tablet device, which enabled her to type answers without direct facilitator influence. During a session, Haley's therapist's calculator battery unexpectedly failed, prompting the therapist to switch to another calculator kept entirely out of Haley's sight. This calculator displayed answers in logarithmic notation, a highly specific mathematical representation not typically taught to children. Remarkably, Haley immediately provided answers precisely matching the hidden logarithmic format, an outcome virtually impossible without visual or sensory access. Confronted, Haley explicitly confirmed via typed responses that she could see the numerators and denominators directly inside the therapist's mind. Such explicit, detailed evidence profoundly challenged Powell's previously skeptical, rigorously scientific outlook. She recognized that conventional explanations, chance guessing, subconscious cueing, fell drastically short. Even critics who argue these cases involve facilitated communication or unintentional cueing must reckon explicitly with Powell's insistence on stringent experimental conditions, especially in cases like Ramsey's, where facilitated communication was categorically ruled out due to his verbal capabilities. Powell was clear that she carefully excluded common pitfalls associated with psi claims. She personally controlled environments to remove any possibility of sensory leakage, ensuring the integrity and reliability of her findings. The evidence Powell collected transcends anecdote precisely because it involved replicable, observable, and measurable phenomena. However, even the most rigorous demonstrations remain fiercely contested by mainstream academia, largely due to entrenched philosophical commitments rather than genuine empirical refutation. Powell recognized this paradox early. No matter how rigorous the experimental methodology, phenomena labeled paranormal evoke an instinctual skepticism and resistance deeply ingrained in contemporary scientific culture. Yet her response was not retreat but persistence, more rigor, more control, and clearer documentation of empirical conditions and results. Powell's detailed empirical studies, therefore, are not merely remarkable stories, but carefully curated challenges to conventional scientific thinking. They demand explicit acknowledgement from critics. Each meticulously documented instance, Ramsey's multilingual fluency and Haley's unprompted logarithmic answers, stands as a powerful empirical challenge, pressing upon mainstream science an obligation either to provide credible alternative explanations or to expand its conceptual horizons radically. Powell's research, by its sheer rigor and the remarkable consistency of its results, compels us toward an unprecedented reconsideration of what consciousness might truly be. Powell's challenge to conventional neuroscience emerges clearly in her hypothesis about consciousness, specifically the theory of non-local consciousness, an idea that challenges the foundational assumption of modern neuroscience, that consciousness is produced entirely within the physical boundaries of the brain. According to Powell, consciousness is better understood as a universal field or informational reservoir, comparable to digital data stored remotely in a cloud rather than confined within the hardware of our brains. This provocative theory aligns explicitly with recent developments in quantum physics, particularly the hypothesis advanced by renowned anesthesiologist and neuroscientist Stuart Hameroff, who posits that consciousness arises from quantum processes occurring within microtubules, microscopic structures integral to brain cells. Powell integrates Hameroff's model with her own empirical observations to argue explicitly for the existence of non-local consciousness. She suggests that the autistic savants she studied demonstrate psychic abilities precisely because their neurological processing differs fundamentally from neurotypical individuals. Powell notes specifically that autistic individuals often display heightened sensory sensitivities, perfect pitch, acute visual and auditory perception, and sensory overload, at frequencies typically inaccessible or unnoticed by neurotypical brains. These exceptional perceptual abilities may allow them to access, decode, or interact with information encoded in what Powell describes as informational fields existing beyond ordinary sensory perception. Moreover, Powell explicitly argues that this heightened sensitivity to information outside conventional perception resembles neurological states typically associated with dreaming or altered states of consciousness. In dreams, humans commonly accept information intuitively, unfiltered by analytical skepticism or logical critique, exactly how autistic individuals might function neurologically during their waking state. According to Powell, autistic savants' daily experiences may thus closely resemble the altered perceptual states neurotypical people enter during dreaming or meditation. It is precisely in these states, free from rigid analytical reasoning and preconceived boundaries, that extraordinary intuitive insights, inspirations, and even psychic phenomena reportedly emerge. Powell explicitly references numerous historically documented cases of scientific breakthroughs occurring spontaneously in states of intuition or dreams, such as Francis Crick's visualization of the DNA double helix structure. Such examples, she argues, illustrate precisely why intuition should not be excluded categorically from scientific methodology, but rather integrated as a complementary form of cognition capable of genuine epistemic contributions. Her argument is not merely that intuition or altered perception might occasionally yield useful insights, but that they may represent fundamentally legitimate, scientifically comprehensible modes of accessing information fields or universal consciousness. This radical conceptual shift, Powell suggests, should provoke mainstream neuroscience to reconsider deeply held assumptions about consciousness as a purely localized neurological phenomenon. Powell's hypothesis thereby extends beyond autistic savants or psychic phenomena alone. It becomes a philosophical critique of contemporary neuroscience, highlighting explicitly how its unquestioned materialist framework may limit understanding by prematurely dismissing alternative epistemological pathways to knowledge. By demonstrating rigorously that certain extraordinary psychic abilities defy conventional explanation, Powell's work implicitly demands a paradigmatic shift, one where consciousness is seen not merely as brain-dependent, but potentially as part of an interconnected quantum fabric accessible to humans in ways previously dismissed as impossible. When Powell first encountered stories from parents about autistic children meeting telepathically at a mysterious place known simply as the Hill, even she was hesitant. The concept itself, described as a non-local meeting space existing solely in consciousness, seemed initially too remarkable, even fantastical, to easily accept. Yet these claims persisted with striking consistency across multiple unrelated families, separated geographically, culturally, and unaware of one another's accounts. Each described the Hill similarly, a metaphysical gathering place in consciousness devoid of physical presence, where nonverbal autistic individuals, often miles apart physically, would reportedly communicate, exchanging knowledge, ideas, and emotions with clarity and sophistication. For Powell, these consistent, detailed reports across separate cases and geographic distances represented compelling anecdotal evidence, impossible to ignore or dismiss as mere coincidence or fantasy. The striking aspect, according to Powell, was not merely the remarkable nature of these communications, but their intellectual sophistication. Autistic children, previously dismissed as cognitively impaired by conventional medical and educational frameworks, were reportedly teaching each other complex ideas, stories, and even academic subjects remotely through telepathic communication. This represented a profound and deeply poignant discovery, dramatically challenging prevailing assumptions that non-speaking autistic individuals were intellectually impaired or developmentally incapable. Powell emphasizes that the very idea of autistic individuals communicating across physical distances without any conventional sensory medium introduces profound implications about consciousness, intelligence, and the very nature of human interaction itself. Critically, Powell's descriptions do not reflect naive acceptance of anecdotal accounts. Instead, she explicitly advocates scientifically rigorous empirical verification to test these extraordinary claims. She details clearly the types of rigorous experiments that could verify the reality of the Hill, controlled experiments involving precise messages shared between autistic individuals in isolated, controlled environments, carefully removing all sensory cues or possibilities for facilitated communication. Powell's insistence on scientific rigor here is significant and deliberate. She is conscious of the skepticism her claims inevitably provoke, and thus demands meticulous experimental conditions designed explicitly to withstand skeptical critique. However, the existence of the hill also pushes Powell's theories to the outermost boundaries of contemporary neuroscience and philosophy. If validated, this phenomenon would require acknowledging not only the reality of telepathy, but also the radical possibility that human minds could access a shared, non-local informational dimension at will. Powell explicitly acknowledges that such a scenario currently exists within the realm of anecdote awaiting empirical validation. Yet she maintains it remains genuinely plausible based on the consistency of multiple independent accounts and her previous direct observations of psi abilities in autistic children. Crucially, Powell explicitly connects the concept of the hill to historical and cultural descriptions of a universal consciousness field, such as the Akashic records, famously theorized by psychic Edgar Cayce, a non-local information field accessible in altered states of consciousness. By invoking this connection, Powell is placing the claims about the hill explicitly within a broader philosophical tradition, one exploring consciousness as inherently interconnected, expansive, and universal, rather than confined strictly within individual brains. This stance invites mainstream science, and society at large, to consider the radical implications. If verified, this phenomenon may offer a profound new understanding not only of consciousness, but of the hidden, extraordinary potentials that exist within human cognition, challenging fundamentally the ways we understand intelligence, communication, and human connection itself. Critics of psi phenomena, particularly telepathy, argue that such claims lack consistent replicability and fail to meet the standard of falsifiability, a core principle of the scientific method. The expectation in mainstream science is that for a phenomenon to be considered real, it must be reliably observed under controlled conditions and reproduced across multiple independent studies. Powell does not dispute the importance of these criteria, but contends that the issue may not lie in the phenomenon itself, but in the way it is being tested. Psi research has historically struggled with variable results, which skeptics interpret as evidence that such abilities are illusory, subconscious guesswork, or methodological flaws. However, Powell suggests that this inconsistency may stem from the rigid structure of standard lab-based testing, which could actively suppress the very effects researchers aim to observe. Unlike physical phenomena which operate independently of human perception, psi abilities may be highly sensitive to cognitive, emotional, and interpersonal variables. For example, if telepathic communication relies on a unique cognitive state, one that is disrupted by stress, skepticism, or overanalysis, then attempting to measure it under highly restrictive clinical settings may be inherently self-defeating. Powell draws a parallel to early quantum physics experiments, where scientists initially struggled with reproducibility until they adapted their methodologies to account for the observer effect, the realization that the act of measurement itself alters the phenomenon being studied. She argues that psi research may require a similar shift in approach, moving beyond static mechanistic models toward experimental frameworks that allow for contextual dynamic influences on cognition. This does not mean abandoning rigor, but developing methodologies suited to the nature of the subject being studied. While critics dismiss psi as pseudoscience, Powell argues that true scientific skepticism should be a tool for discovery, not a mechanism for dismissal. She challenges skeptics to define what level of evidence would be sufficient to reconsider their stance. If nonverbal autistic individuals under strict double-blind conditions can consistently exchange telepathic messages, would that constitute proof, or would critics continue shifting the goalposts? She warns that if no amount of evidence could ever change their position, they are no longer engaging in science, but in philosophical dogmatism. Powell's stance is not one of certainty in psi, but certainty in the need for open-minded investigation. She acknowledges that more rigorous, large-scale studies are necessary, but argues that dismissing psi outright without testing it under conditions adapted to its unique characteristics is a failure of scientific inquiry. If consciousness operates in ways we do not yet fully understand, then SHA methodologies must evolve accordingly. Powell insists that the purpose of science is not to reinforce existing paradigms, but to push the boundaries of knowledge, even when doing so challenges our most fundamental assumptions. The widespread resistance to seriously examining psi phenomena is not just a scientific issue. It is a reflection of deep-seated cultural and philosophical commitments embedded in modern intellectual traditions. Powell argues that contemporary science, while invaluable, operates within an unspoken materialist framework that assumes all cognition is brain-generated and all knowledge must be strictly empirical, quantifiable, and repeatable. This paradigm has led to a systematic exclusion of psi phenomena, not necessarily because they lack supporting evidence, but because they challenge the foundational assumptions of reductionist neuroscience. Powell critiques this bias, emphasizing that skepticism towards psi is often philosophical rather than empirical. The mainstream scientific method demands strict replicability, a requirement that, while effective for studying mechanistic physical laws, may be ill-suited for complex cognitive and consciousness-related phenomena. Psi effects, if real, may be subtle, influenced by mental states, environmental conditions, and even observer biases. Powell argues that dismissing such anomalies outright, rather than adapting methodologies to account for their variability, is a failure of scientific curiosity rather than a victory for skepticism. To support her argument, Powell references historical precedents where major scientific breakthroughs initially faced rejection. The discovery of germ theory, quantum mechanics, and the link between gut microbiota and mental health were all met with initial resistance because they contradicted dominant paradigms. She argues that psi research may be experiencing a similar cycle of premature dismissal, where data that does not conform to existing models is ignored rather than investigated. Importantly, Powell does not claim that psi phenomena are definitively proven. Instead, she insists that science should be driven by evidence, not by philosophical comfort. If extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, then extraordinary resistance to new ideas also demands extraordinary justification. She challenges skeptics to articulate what kind of experiment or result would be sufficient to change their stance, warning that if no possible evidence could convince them, they are no longer engaging in scientific skepticism, but in ideological gatekeeping. Powell's argument is not an attack on the scientific method, but a call for its expansion. She suggests that current methodologies designed for material processes may need to evolve to better study consciousness, cognition, and non-local information exchange. If psi phenomena exist, they may require new frameworks of inquiry, just as quantum physics forced a re-evaluation of classical mechanics. Her position is clear. If mainstream science is truly committed to understanding the full extent of human cognition, then it must be willing to investigate even the most challenging and unsettling possibilities. The prevailing scientific and medical view of autism has long been shaped by a deficit-based model, where nonverbal individuals are often assumed to have severe cognitive impairments simply because they do not communicate in conventional ways. Powell challenges this assumption, arguing that intelligence in autistic individuals may be far more complex and underestimated than mainstream neuroscience acknowledges. Her research suggests that some nonverbal autistic individuals may demonstrate extraordinary cognitive abilities, ranging from enhanced pattern recognition and mathematical processing to possible telepathic communication. If these abilities exist, then autism must be reconsidered not as a disorder to be corrected, but as a different cognitive architecture that mainstream science has yet to fully understand. Powell's work suggests that scientific biases may be actively preventing the recognition of autistic intelligence. The widespread assumption that intelligence must be measured through language, standardized testing, and neurotypical forms of problem-solving creates a systemic blind spot one that ignores the possibility that autistic individuals may process and access information through alternative, less easily measurable pathways. Powell argues that nonverbal autistic individuals, rather than lacking intelligence, may be engaging in cognition that is simply invisible to conventional assessment methods. This raises a critical epistemological question. How much of what we define as intelligence is shaped by our own limitations in recognizing it? Beyond cognitive abilities, Powell explores the ethical consequences of failing to take autistic experiences seriously. If nonverbal autistic individuals are fully conscious, highly intelligent, and potentially capable of psi abilities, then their systematic exclusion from scientific research, education, and decision-making about their own lives may constitute not just a scientific oversight, but an ethical failure. Powell argues that dismissing their experiences without rigorous investigation perpetuates a form of epistemic injustice, a refusal to acknowledge a population's intellectual contributions simply because they do not fit into pre-existing categories of intelligence. The implications of Powell's research extend beyond neuroscience into education, ethics, and disability rights. If her findings are validated, then the way autism is understood and treated would need to undergo a radical shift. Current models of autism intervention focus on behavioral training to normalize autistic individuals, rather than creating environments that nurture their unique cognitive strengths. Powell's work suggests that this approach may be fundamentally flawed, as it prioritizes neurotypical expectations rather than exploring and fostering the full cognitive potential of autistic individuals. At the core of Powell's argument is a demand for scientific humility. She does not claim that all autistic individuals possess psychic abilities, nor does she argue that every nonverbal individual has hidden intelligence. Instead, she insists that the failure to investigate these possibilities with scientific rigor reflects a deeper problem: science's tendency to reject what it does not yet understand. If autistic individuals, particularly non-verbal ones, have been systematically misjudged, then the broader implications of Powell's work go beyond autism itself. They challenge us to reconsider how intelligence is defined, who gets to define it, and what ethical responsibilities arise when those definitions exclude entire populations from meaningful recognition. If Powell's research is correct, then we are not merely misunderstanding autism, we are misunderstanding consciousness itself. The assumption that cognition is strictly a product of neural activity within the brain has dominated mainstream science for centuries. However, Powell's findings suggest that some individuals, particularly nonverbal autistic savants, may be capable of accessing information beyond conventional sensory perception. Whether this is due to enhanced cognitive processing, non-local consciousness, or an unidentified mechanism, the implications are staggering. If intelligence and communication can occur through means that defy our current neuroscientific models, then the boundaries of what we consider possible must expand. The scientific establishment has long been resistant to paradigm-shifting discoveries, especially those that challenge materialist frameworks. Powell's work suggests that psi phenomena, if real, do not contradict science, but instead demand a revision of its scope. She does not argue that science should abandon rigor or skepticism. On the contrary, she insists that a refusal to investigate anomalous cognition with full empirical scrutiny is a failure of the scientific process itself. True skepticism should be a tool for discovery, not a shield against uncomfortable ideas. Beyond the implications for autism, Powell's research forces a profound reconsideration of the nature of human intelligence. If nonverbal autistic individuals are capable of telepathic communication, then our current models of intelligence, perception, and selfhood may be deeply incomplete. This raises existential questions. Is consciousness purely individual, or is it interconnected in ways we have yet to understand? Is intelligence confined to the brain, or does it extend beyond it? These questions, once confined to philosophy and spirituality, now stand at the threshold of scientific investigation. The broader issue Powell highlights is science's institutional reluctance to engage with the unknown. Throughout history, disruptive discoveries, from heliocentrism to quantum mechanics, have been met with resistance, not because of a lack of evidence, but because they forced a re-evaluation of established beliefs. If psi phenomena are real, then dismissing them outright is not an act of scientific rigor, but of intellectual conservatism. Powell argues that the next step is not blind acceptance of telepathy or non-local consciousness, but a commitment to develop experimental frameworks that allow for their fair and rigorous study. Powell's work is an invitation to scientists, philosophers, and society at large to reconsider not just what we know, but how we know it. The study of consciousness remains one of the last great scientific frontiers, and if Powell's findings hold, they could reshape the fundamental understanding of mind, intelligence, and reality itself. The real challenge is not whether psi exists, it is whether science is prepared to expand its boundaries to explore it. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Think podcast, an audio essay read by me, Holly, your digital narrator. For further reading, resources, and recommendations, visit the episode webpage linked in the description. Until next time.